Today's daf we're going to be learning Zevachim daf lamed chet. Today's daf is sponsored in honor of Judy Berman. We celebrate Judy's incredible achievement of completing Seder Nezikin and making a siyum in the snack community of Netanya with love from her children and grandchildren in Israel and Teaneck. Mazal tov. Okay, today, Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan, we're going to start asking for rain soon, and Zayim Mar Cheshvan in Israel anyway. And with that, we're going to start our Ta'anit challenge. So it's a great opportunity if people want to review Masechet Ta'anit, or maybe really more so for people who haven't yet learned Gemara or learn but don't have time for Daf Yomi. It's a 4-day-a-week challenge for about 6 or 7 weeks, and we recommend that you pass it around and introduce people to learning with Hadran, and it's a great way to kind of learn how our new website works. That it makes it much easier to learn a Masechet. You can sign up, like we start with the first daf of a Masechet, and then you sign up, and then it basically sends you notifications as you finish each daf. It'll kind of pop up what you're up to. Makes it very easy, seamless way to learn a Masechet. And there'll be introductory videos. So that if someone's new to Gemara, there'll be short intro videos with Chamutal Shoval that will basically kind of help guide you along in the learning. So it's a great way to recommend someone. The best way we find to spread the learning of Gemara is by word of mouth. Okay, so feel free to be our ambassadors for this important task. We're going to get started today. We are trying to figure out what is the source for Beit Hillel for saying that one matana, one placement of the blood for the chatat, it's just like all the other korbanot. One is sufficient. Okay. Now, it's like all the other ones in the mizbeach hachitzoni of the normal korbanot, the regular ones that are done on the outer altar. Remember, the inner altar ones, we said like the par Yom Kippurim and the par Davar Shel Tzibur and the par Kohen Mashiach and the unique korbanot, the seir. There's some seirim, the seir avodah zarah, that are when the people mistakenly worship idols. There's the seir on Yom Kippur. The bloods of those all go on the inner altar, as opposed to what we're discussing right now is the outer altar. In the inner altar, whatever number of placings are necessary, are necessary. Outside, on the outer altar, whatever it is, whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, right, only one is necessary. Okay, there's no 3, I don't think, but anyway, it's either 2, right, 1, 2, or 4. So with it, what Beit Hillel says is that one in the chatat is sufficient, even though it's really supposed to go on all 4 corners of the altar. According to Beit Shammai, you need 2 for the sin offering. It's different from all the others. So we saw yesterday the source of their opinion is kanot, right? Beit Shammai darshaned it. Doesn't matter that it's missing a vav in 2 places. It's Rabbi, 2, 4, 6. You get to 6. What does 6 do for you? Well, 4 are critical. 4 is the mitzvah, okay, to do on all 4. And then another 2 is la'akev. It means 2 of those are essential, must happen. Okay, meaning if they don't happen, there's no atonement. If this doesn't happen, you can't start burning the parts on the altar. You can't eat the meat, right? Because remember, the zrika is what we call a matir. That's why, if you remember, the pigul happens in the zrika, and all the actions that lead up, the shchita, kabbalah, holachan, zrika, because they're all related to the blood, and the blood is the matir. You can only have pigul in the matir, in the action that permits something else to happen. Okay, for example, burning the parts on the altar don't permit anything. You can already eat the meat at that point. There's nothing else that needs permitting. So if you have a thought while you're burning the parts on the altar, it's irrelevant, okay? Because that doesn't it doesn't make it pigul, because that's not a matir. That's just a side point about pigul that's worth reminding you of. Now, what we see here is that Beit Hillel said, kanot. We go by the way it's written. It's written without a vav in 2 places. That only gets you to 4. Okay, so what does he do with the 4? Well, 3 lemitzvah, 1 la'akev. That's how he learns it. Or maybe he says we go by, and that's where we ended the mikra and the masoret, both how it's read and how it's written. And that gets us 4 in one reading, 5 in another, right? If we go by the way it's read, it's 6. Sorry, I said 5, I meant 6. And if we go by the way it's written, it's 4, because it's written without the vav in 2 places. Remember, the vav is plural. So without the vav, it's singular. So that would get us to 4. So what do? We have 6, we have 4. We go with the middle, 5. So then we said, what about tefillin? You could say the same thing with tefillin, right? Even though we said that doesn't exactly match our text, but either they had a different text or they darshan it in some unique way, but then you would get to 5 batim of the tefillin. But we resolved that. We said maybe he holds like Rabbi Akiva that you get to the 4 batim not from that drasha. You get there from the fact that there's tat and there's pat, right? Totafot is made up of two different words from two different languages that each means two, and that's how you get to 4. Then we said, what about basukah, basukah, basukot? Sukkot, twice it's mentioned without a vav, once it's mentioned with a vav. That would get you to 5 again. And if we go with 5, what you have? You need 5 walls of a sukkah, right? Imagine trying to build a sukkah with 5 walls. That would be interesting. Right? You'd have a pentagon sukkah. So my answer is starting with the top of our daf. Hatam chad kra kule legufe. No, it's not really 5 here because one pasuk drops because it's needed to teach you have to sit in a sukkah. It's needed for its own sake. Chad l'schacha. The second one is to say you need schach. What defines a sukkah? The schach. You need the schach on the sukkah. And then what's left? 3, and that teaches you about the walls. Ata hilchata bigar ata l'shlishi v'ukmata tefach. And then you have 3, but now we have to get to the fact that the third wall only needs to be a tefach of width, and that's because there's a halacha l'moshe misinai. Ata hilchata means the halacha comes, but halacha in the context of this means halacha l'moshe misinai. There's an old tradition that says one of the walls only needs to be a tefach, so that drops it down to 2 and part of the third wall. Okay, so we resolved that one. Third and last question. Elameata v'tama shvu'ayim. Now this is about a woman who gives birth. If she gives birth to a male, she's tameh for 7 days. For a female, 14 days. Then if she continues to bleed, her blood is called dam tohar. In the times of the temple, this was very relevant. You couldn't go into the temple until the end of that. Okay. Nowadays we don't have that issue. Okay. And we don't actually hold by the 7 and the 14 either. We hold until the dam stops, and that's for a different reason, which we'll get to when we talk about it in Nida. But anyway, the point is her dam that she's tameh according to Torah law is 2 weeks, shvu'ayim. But it's written without a vav. It should be shin bet vav ayin, shavua, right? Shvu'ayim. But it's actually, and it should have 2 yuds really, but it's written as shiv'im, 70. Okay, that's a big difference, 14 and 70. So shiv'im, because it says shiv'im, ahani krava, ahani masoret. If we go with this average, right, arba'im b'trein by l'meitav, she should have to be 42 days in dam tameh, right, impure blood, right, which basically means she can't be with her husband for all those days. To which they say, Shane hatam dichtiv kin nidata. There it says she's like a nida. Now a nida is 7 days. So 14 is kind of similar to 7, right? It's double. But we're not going to get up to 42, okay, even though it is divisible by 7, but it's way different than 42, and therefore that's why we don't say it in that situation. But it doesn't mean that by us it wouldn't be the case, and we're done with that. So we have our proof for Beit Hillel. It's learned from kranot, in possibly 2 different manners of darshaning that, as we saw. Now we're going to bring another way of getting to a reason of Beit Hillel. And the way it's introduced in the Gemara is Tanna ma'itela mehacha. A different Tanna brings it from here. Here meaning what we're about to say. So now we're going to start a whole different proof for Beit Hillel. So we have kranot is one path, which kind of splits into 2, how exactly you get it from there. Now we're going to go on this drasha, v'chiper. Mipnei hadin. Okay, this word mipnei hadin is a little bit strange. Mipnei hadin means out of logic. Now, it's not logic, it's a drasha. But what it seems to be saying is, and we'll see this in a minute, there's this drasha v'chiper, which we'll get to what that is exactly. This is coming to counter the logic, or maybe because we can't get to a logical explanation, so we need a drasha. Okay, so we're going to explain first what were the possible logical explanation you could get to it from logic. When all of that fails, which they're already telling you it's doomed to fail, we're going to use the drasha v'chiper. Before we even start, let's just tell it, where are these v'chiper from? So we're in Vayikra chapter 4, which is the chapter with the 4 chataot that we learned about in Horayot. The chatat that the Kohen Mashiach, if he sins, right? These are all the chataot pnimiyot. Okay, well, 2 of them are the chataot pnimiyot. Then we're going to move to the regular chataot. So there's 2 and 2. So there's the par Kohen Mashiach. That's how it starts. Then we go to the par Helen Dever Shel Tzibor. Both are cases where someone makes an erroneous ruling, either the Kohen Gadol himself or the court, and the Kohen Gadol follows the Kohen Gadol's erroneous ruling, or the majority of the people follow the Beit Din's erroneous ruling, and then they have to bring this par offering that's brought on the inner altar, etc. That's not what we're talking about. The next two sections are if the Nasi sins, then he brings it's a unique sin offering for the Nasi, but it's not a unique one that it goes in the inner altar, it goes on the outer altar. It's a chatat, a type of chatat. And then we have the individual, and the individual can either bring a goat offering or a sheep offering for their sin offering. So that's just a regular individual that sins. That's our classic. You ate chaylev, you didn't realize it was chaylev, and then you bring your sin offering. So, right, because it's all for unwitting sins. So in the section about the Nasi, and in the section about the individual who brings a goat, and in the section about the individual who brings a sheep, by each place it goes through what you're supposed to do. And it says, v'chiper, okay? It says, and this will atone for him. Okay, generally it says something like, because we're going to get to this later, that's what I want you to say, v'chiper alav kohen mechatato, and the kohen then succeeds in getting atonement by sacrificing the sacrifice for the person, which generally is the blood, okay, succeeds in getting atonement for this person, v'nislach, and he is forgiven, okay? All of them have the language v'chiper and also v'nislach. That's why I'm telling you that, because that's going to come up later. But right now we're interested in v'chiper, but we're really not interested in it yet, because what we're going to do right now is we're going to talk about the logical argument you could have made to prove that perhaps that one placing of the blood is sufficient. You might have thought, well, we can explain this logically. Okay, usually in the Midrash Halakha, when it says this lamata, it says this lamala, what it means is later in the psukim and earlier in the psukim, but that's not what it means here. There's bloods that go on the top part of the altar, and there's bloods that go on the bottom part of the altar, or really it started with bottom and went to top. There's bloods on the bottom. That's all the korbanot other than the sin offering are put on the lower part. Remember, we talked about there's bloods that go above, there's bloods that go below. Generally, it's the sin offering goes above, and all the other offerings generally are below that chura sikra, that red line that is in the half point of the height of the altar. Remember, the altar was very high, right? That's why there's a ramp going up. So there's blood that goes lower down, and there's blood right on the bottom part. There's blood that goes on the upper part. Mama tandamim. So then we can compare them. Mama tandamim hamurim lamata shenitanam b'matana chakiper. Right, we learned that already. That all the other bloods, one is sufficient. So aftamim hamurim lamala. So likewise, also the sin offering that goes above shenitanam b'matana chakiper. That one should be sufficient. That would be the logic. But now the Gemara says, or we could go the other way. Oh, kalech l'derech zo. It's a classic midrash halacha where it's basically saying, who's to say that's logic? You could say the exact opposite logic. Ne'emru damim bifnim v'ne'emru damim b'chutz. Now there's blood of sin offerings that are brought inside, and there's blood of sin offerings that are brought outside. We're obviously talking about the outer ones, remember? But we mentioned there were these blood offerings that go inside. Ma damim hamurim bifnim. Now the ones that go inside, we already learned in our Mishnah. Chisar achat min hamatanot lo asav lo klum. If you missed one of them, you didn't do anything. Aftamim hamurim b'chutz. So likewise, the sin offering bloods that are brought outside, chisar achat min hamatanot lo asav lo klum. Maybe it would be the same then as the sin offerings brought inside. And if you don't do one, it's as if you didn't do anything. So the logical argument continues. Near elemi domet. Let's try to figure out to which is it more similar, and therefore we should learn from that one. But here we're going to also get confused because you could go either way. Danim chutz michutz ve'in danim chutz mipnim. The logic to go with option A is to say, well, outer altar, outer altar. Let's learn the outer altar from the outer altar. Oh, kalech l'derech zo. Or maybe we go the other way. Danim chatat va'arba kranot mechatat va'arba kranot. Right? How is it similar to the ones brought inside? Because there were both sin offerings that go, and the blood goes on all four corners. Most of the other sacrifices, first of all, you don't put them on the corners. You put them at the bottom of the altar. Corners, by the way, I want to clarify. Kranot is not, in Hebrew, it might translate as corner, but the keren of the Mizbeach is actually, that's how we know it has to be at the top of the altar. It's like a protrusion that was 1 cubit wide by 1 cubit long by 1 cubit in height. Okay, a 1 by 1 by 1 cubit protrusion at the top of the altar in the four corners. Okay, so that is done on the four corners, and the ones on the inner altar were also done at the four corners. Okay, you could call it the horn, right? A Karen is also a horn. Karen Zavid is a corner, right? Karen is used also as a horn and also as a corner. So you're right that Karen translates literally as a horn. You could also go at the horn of the Mizbeach. I think it's really the corners of the altar, but at the top. Okay? Exact translation you can figure out. That's the idea. So now, they say, so now, which is it more similar to? You could say the opposite, right? That this korban is unique because it's done on all four kranot, just like the one done inside, and it's a sin offering. So therefore, learn chatat and arba kranot from chatat and arba kranot, and therefore you'd say maybe they're all necessary. Va'al yochiach chutz, don't learn it from the outer altar, she'en chatat va'arba kranot, right? Doesn't have those criteria. So now we realize why the logic completely fails, because you could use a logical argument this way, you could use a logical argument that way. Going back to the beginning now, Talmud Lomal, v'chiper, v'chiper, v'chiper. Now, that didn't help us yet to know, how do we know, because it says v'chiper 3 times, that it teaches you only one is necessary. So now we're going to learn how we get there. And then we're going to question it and say, maybe you could say v'chiper, v'chiper, v'chiper is darshan some other way, and we're going to go through a bunch of questions about that. V'chiper. Okay, so now the first time it appears, we're going to say like this. V'chiper means you get atonement, and what they're going to mean is, even if you didn't do everything. So what does the first one come to say? The first one comes to say you're going to get atonement anyway, even if you only did 3. Then it comes again. So the second time it comes, what's it going to do? It's going to drop us down to 2. Then we're going to go again. V'chiper third time. Okay, that's the drasha. So now we're going to have 2 main questions on this. The first one's a short one, but we're going to answer quickly, and the other one's going to take a little longer to answer. First question. Don't you need it to tell you that you need atonement? That, in other words, not that you need atonement, that this provides you with atonement. If you do this, you will be atoned for the sin that you did. To which I'm a Rava, this is why I read you the V'nislach before. Bar Adamari Ezbrali. Okay, Bar Adamari, he taught me this. Amar Kra v'chiper v'nislach zoe kapara zoe slicha. What is slicha? Generally, slicha is forgiveness, but what it really means is atonement, right? God forgives you for your sin. That means you received atonement. So kapara and slicha are basically synonymous, which means that if you really needed it to tell you that this affects atonement for you, you got it in the word v'nislach, and the word v'chiper is unnecessary and can be used for a drasha. But now, so the fact that it can be used to darshan, we got. But maybe it can be used to a different drasha. And now the Gemara is going to suggest, maybe you should read it like this. And then we wouldn't conclude that, we would conclude actually that you need all 4, but they don't have to be exactly the way we think they have to be. That's where this is going to go. V'chiper, and it's going to do the same thing. Each time it drops us a level. V'chiper, afa pishalonatan ela shalosh lamala ve'echad lamata. Say, oh wait, you're supposed to do them all 4 at the top. But the first time it says v'chiper, it's to tell you, well, if you did 1 below and 3 on top, it's still okay. V'chiper, the second time comes to teach you, alpha b'shalonatan l'shtayim lamata v'shtayim lamala, 2 and 2. Third v'chiper, now this one's going to be a little surprising. What are you expecting it to say? 1 and 3. That's not what it says. V'chiper, alpha b'shalonatan lamala ela lamata. The third one is coming to drop it instead of 2 and 2 to 0 and 4. Okay, even if you did none on the above and 4 down below. Now, we don't really know why they jumped like that from 2 and 2, right? They went from 3 and 1 to 2 and 2 to 0 and 4. So that's, now they're going to say, maybe what it's trying to tell you is you need to do all 4. But if they're all sprinkled on the bottom part of the altar, that will be sufficient. Okay, it's not the ideal, but it'll work. Amar of Adabar Yitzchak, im ken bitata Torah kranot. Okay, skip the word arba, that doesn't belong there. If that's the case, then you've completely lost the halacha of the kranot of the altar, because the kranot are at the top of the altar. So they say that shouldn't bother you, because irachman amar libatzlun. If the Torah said so, then the Torah said so. In other words, yes, the Torah says you have to put it on the 4 corners, or the 4 corners at the top of the altar. But if you threw it at the bottom of the altar 4 times, right, on all 4 sides, that could work. And the Torah is telling you, yeah, it's fine. It works that way. The Torah tells you, the Torah tells you. Now, the Torah didn't tell you, but this is, if that's what the drasha means, then it could be the Torah is telling you, you don't need to do it. So now we're going to have a different reason to reject this, because that logic of, you've gotten rid of the whole law of kranot, maybe you could. In other words, again, there's the ideal and there's the post facto. If it happened, maybe it still works. So now Rav is going to reject this drasha for a different reason. Amar Rava, ezehu davar shetzarich shalosh, hevei omel elu kranot. In the end, this is a drasha of three, right? V'chiper, v'chiper, v'chiper. Now, what we ended up doing was, we basically said four, according to this alternate suggestion, we said, perhaps if you did all four at the bottom, what he's basically saying is what I said before, which is how we got from 2 and 2 to 0 and 4, right? They're asking in a bit of a different way, but this has nothing to do with 3. If it were 3, it would be more like 1 and 3, right? If you did 1 on top, 3 at the bottom. This doesn't have to do with 3 at all. This has to do with 4. You're basically saying all 4 could be done at the bottom. But there's a 3-part drasha, chiper, chiper, chiper. That fits much better with take 1, take 2, take 3. All you're left with is 1. And that's our drasha. So that's how he rejects this drasha. But the Gemara says, Ema, you could still say, and now we're going to go back to what I said they didn't say, but maybe you could go back to that alternate suggestion and fix it. And then make it related to 3. Maybe it gets you to 1 above and 3 below, okay? Meaning, first one gets you to 3 and 1. Second one gets you to 2 and 2. Third one gets you to 1 and 3. And then 1 above, 3 below would work. Why didn't we suggest that? And maybe that's an alternative suggestion that could work to reject our drasha. Okay, this whole thing is, again, part of the second question, which is, right, maybe there's an alternative way, right? The first question was, we need those words for themselves. And then we said, no, we don't, because Nislach teaches that. The second was, maybe there's an alternative drasha. So we gave an alternative, but that alternative didn't work because it really doesn't relate to 3, it relates to 4. So maybe we'll change it a little bit, modify it to actually make it work, be relevant for 3. And then this could really be a good rejection. But the Gemara says, wait, there's no way that could be. And that might explain why they jumped from 2 and 2 to 0 and 4 from the beginning. Because lo matzinu damim shechatzian lamala v'chatzian lamata. We don't have a precedent for a case where some blood is poured at the top and some blood is poured at the bottom. There's no such thing. Okay, nobody would ever have in their right mind a thought that you could do the blood on the top and the bottom. Okay, in other words, maybe, right? Remember we learned nitzanim lamala, if you did them lamata, it works and all that. But nobody thinks that you could do part and part. So now they're going to say, what do you mean? Maybe there are, and they're going to suggest a bunch of suggestions until they eventually reject them all. Okay, and we're left with again. It couldn't be 0 and 4, right? 0 and 4, and that's what this drasha is teaching you. Because if you did them all at the bottom instead of the top, that can't be what you're learning from v'chiper, 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 because there's only 3, and that really teaches something that's related to 4. And it can't be some above, some below the 3 and 1, or 1 and 3, which would have worked, because there's no such precedent. Now we're going to try to suggest maybe there is a precedent. Below, v'hatznan, doesn't it say? Hizami menu achat lamala v'sheva lamata. This is when the Kohen Gadol went into the Kodesh Kodeshim and he takes the blood from the bull and the goat offering and he sprinkles the blood toward the kaporet. Some people say on the kaporet, some people say toward. This seems to say on the kaporet. You'll see why in a minute. What does he do? Hizami menu achat lamala v'sheva lamata. That's why we count achat v'shtayim, because he does 1 above and 7 below. Okay, now what is 1 above? 1 goes to the top part of the kaporet, and right, which was the covering of the aron, and 7 go below. Now, it's not exactly the altar, but it is a case where you're going to have some going up, some going down. So which the Gemara says, no, you totally misunderstood that Mishnah. When it says achat lamala v'sheva lamata, it doesn't mean 1 on the upper part and 7 on the bottom. It means kimatzlif. It's like a matzlif. Okay, what's a matzlif? The Gemara is going to ask. My kimatzlif? Mechavi Rav Yehuda showed him, and he did it kiminagdana. Okay, we've learned this already. What's a kiminagdana? Like one who gives lashes. Now, when you give lashes, you take a whip and you kind of throw your hand, right, with a twist of your elbow, I guess you would say, right? You reach forward. Now, they would often do one like lifting your hand high and then one lifting your hand low. And then the blood, one goes a little farther if you're comparing it to blood now, if the Kohen took his hand And first, like a higher one, and then a lower one. Okay, that's what it means. A chal lamala, where it's higher, where it goes farther, and then one where it goes less far. But that's not going to be above and below. It's just going to end up at a bit of a distance from each other. But that's not a good proof. Okay, next one. Still in the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippur. Vihizad, but now there's 7 sprinklings the Kohen Gadol does also on the inner altar with the blood. So here it says, Hiza al taharosh hamizbeach sheva pamim. It says he sprinkles on the taharo of the altar. We don't know what that word means. 7 times. So turning now to Amabet, my taharo. So my lav apalge de mizbeach. Does it not mean the mid height of the altar? How do we get to taharosh hamizbeach is the mid, like the middle part of the height of the altar? By the way, this is the inner altar, but it doesn't matter. It would then at least be a precedent. Now, why would this be a precedent if it's the middle of the altar that some goes above, some goes below? Because try to imagine if you're going to throw blood, right, at the middle of the altar, even if you're going to put it on there, right in the middle, you're going to end up with some above, some below, because you can't get it exactly exact spot where it's going to be all below or all above. So especially if you're doing it 7 times, it's going to be hard to be exacting that it's all going to be above or all going to be below. So you're going to end up with blood that's a little, some of it's above, some of it's below. Now, how do we get from Tarosh Mizbeach as the midpoint of the height of the altar? Kedamri Nashe Tahar Tiara Diyoma. People talk about midday. They say the words Tahar Tiara Diyoma. We've gotten to the midpoint of the day. So Tahara sounds like midpoint, which means midpoint of the altar. To which Amarava Brashila, lo, it's not what it means. Agiluye, it's the revealed part. What Tira Diyoma means the clearest point of the day, where the sun is the brightest and you can see as clearly as possible. So while it does happen to be in the middle of the day, the real language of was tahor, to clean, to cleanse, to be completely clean and clear. That's the way we mean it. And then what would it mean? It's the giluye, it's the revealed part of the altar, which is the top part of the altar. It's the roof of the altar, which means the whole thing is on the top. We don't have part at the bottom. It's irrelevant. Dichtiv, how do we know this? That we can translate it this way. We bring a different pasuk, u'cha'etzem hashamayim laTorah. Okay, which is again when it's in midday, but at its clearest point. And that the word is clear. And Rashi even says that they would clean off the top of the altar because the altar had the remains of, incense burning and stuff, and they would clean it off, and it would be this clear spot, and that's what they mean. Okay, and also it's from revealed, giluya, it's the revealed part because it's the part at the top. Okay, so that's not a precedent for high and for above and below. So we try our another attempt. Vaha'ika shirayim. The shirayim, wait a minute. When you put the chata, the sin offering, okay, or the regular one, you're in the outer altar, you put it on the top of the altar, and then what do you do with the remains? It's actually the pasuk where it talks about the remains, just specifically in the chatat. Then you pour the remains on the bottom of the altar and the base. That's at the bottom. So by nature, right, the sin offering already has blood at the top and blood at the bottom. To which they say no. Shirayim lo ma'akve. We don't count the shirayim because the shirayim aren't a critical part, right? If you don't pour the shirayim at the base of the altar, you've achieved atonement anyway. You get atonement from the 4 matanot or another korbanot, other matanot, but whatever number. But the point is, the shirayim are not a critical element, so you can't count them and say, oh, some is above, some is below, because we just don't count that. Now they say, wait a minute. Vaha'ika, our last attempt, shirayim hapnimiyim. In the korbanot that you bring on the inner altar that we were just talking about, the shirayim there, some people hold that they're a critical element, that in those unique korbanot, the par Yom Kippurim, the Shiur Yom Kippurim, the par Lim Davar Shel Tzibur, par Kohen HaMashiach, those unique korbanot, the Shiur Avodah Zarah, of people who follow the erroneous ruling of the court and do idol worship, all of those are unique korbanot, and some people hold that the shirayim in those cases is a critical element of the process. Now, if you hold that, and the shirayim are makvim, again, what happens? The shirayim are poured at the base of the altar, outer altar, and the blood from those korbanot is put on the top of the altar, the inner altar. Okay, so it's different altars, but we have top and bottom, and they're both critical elements. That would be a good precedent. And then that would say, remember what we're up to, because now we're going to finish this. Maybe it's an alternative drasha. Maybe it's trying to say 3 below and 1 above will work for the regular sin offering. That's all done in the outer altar. And maybe that's what it's saying and not what we're trying to prove Beit Hillel. To which they answer, B'chad makom kamrina. No, it's true that there's upper and lower, but we're talking about trying to find a precedent for upper and lower on the same altar. That's one is done on the inner altar, the upper part. This one, the shirayim, are done at the bottom part of the outer altar. That's already two different altars. That's not the same kind of precedent. We're saying that there's no precedent for blood being brought on the same altar, both at the top and at the bottom, and for that we really have no proof. So in the end, we're back to this is a good drasha. Each time it's mentioned, it drops one. One is not important. Two is not important. Three is not important. As long as you do one, it's sufficient. Okay, and basically there were two main questions. One, don't we need that word for itself? No, we have a nislach. Couldn't we learn this drasha some other way? Which then we had two kind of attempts in there because it was to go from 3 and 1, 2 and 2 to 0 and 4. Then we just modified it to 1 and 3 to relate to that. What does that have to do with 3? And then we said that can't possibly be because, and by the way, once we say that can't possibly be because you wouldn't have blood at the top and the bottom, which, we had some questions about that, but resolved them, it explains why they made the jump from 2 and 2 to 0 and 4. Because no one would have thought to get to 1 and 3 because that's just not, you would never have that kind of thing. So they were operating on that assumption. Till that didn't work, and then they suggested the other assumption and then answered it. Well, there's no such thing. Okay, now moving on to a braita, which is really just quoting Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, but because of the way, we're going to see it's quoted in the name of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, because of the way he quotes it, we kind of ask this question, you'll see in a minute, and then we resolve it and move on to the last sugya. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov אומר, Beit Shammai אומרים, שתי מתנות שבחטאת, ואחד שבכל הזבחים, מתירות ומפגלות. This is nothing new. This we know from our Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says that Beit Shammai holds two matanot, right, two placings of the blood in the sin offering, and one for all the other offerings, again, in the outer altar. Mitirot, they all permit their matirs. Okay, we've talked about this a lot, right? Because again, pigul happens in the matir stage. What's a matir? A matir is it allows something else to happen. Meaning, if you sprinkle the blood, and all the actions that lead to the sprinkling of the blood are all part of this matir, and that's why the pigul thoughts are all in that, it permits two things. It permits the imurim to be burnt on the altar. If you didn't sprinkle the blood, you can't burn the imurim, right? The parts that are supposed to get burned are in an ola, the whole animal. You can't burn it till you finish the blood. And their matir, the meat to be eaten. If there's meat to be eaten in that sacrifice, it permits the meat to be eaten. So in the case of all the other korbanot, it's just one placement already affects the matir, right? It's already permitted, whatever else we need to be permitted. And in the chatat, it's two. And because of that, mifaglot, the pigul happens in that stage. So now what's important to say, according to Beit Shammai, what does that mean? If you're going to create a situation where the meat becomes pigul, which then again means if you eat the meat, you get karet, well, it would have to be, remember what we learned, ein mefaglin b'chatzi matir, it would have to be in both matanot for the sin offering. If you had it only in one of the placings, that thought, it wouldn't make it pigul because you didn't have it in the second thought, right? The second one. And there is no pigul in a chatzi matir, in a matir that's only half done, right? In part of it. Okay, so I just want you to note that Beit Shammai on the one hand has a stringency, which is in order to allow the meat to be eaten and the meat to be burnt, you need it to be in two matanot, two placings of the blood, as opposed to Beit Hillel who says one. But there's a leniency also, because if you have a pigul thought in the first placing of the blood, according to Beit Hillel, that will be pigul because you only need one placing. According to Beit Shammai, it's not pigul because you haven't had a pigul thought in the whole machshava. If you didn't have a pigul thought in the second placing, then it wouldn't be pigul. So he has a chumrah and a kula. This is important for the continuation of the sugya. Beit Hillel אומרים, אחד שבחטאת ואחד שבכל הזבחים מתרן ומפגלת. Only one placing is needed, and therefore, it's actually, if you have a pigul thought in that one placing, it's pigul, whether it's a sin offering or any other offering. That's the chumrah. Matkefla Rav Oshaya. Rav Oshaya says the way you explain this, im ken linie gabe kule Beit Shammai v'chumrei Beit Hillel. Well, we know in general that Beit Hillel is much more lenient than Beit Shammai, and there's actually a list they kept of all the stringencies of Beit Shammai. Okay, it appears in a Mishnah. In which cases is Beit Shammai stringent, and in which cases is Beit Shammai more lenient than Beit Hillel? So why isn't this in that list? This should be in that list because when it relates to pigul, Beit Shammai is actually more lenient because if you have a pigul machshava, a pigul thought in, right, meaning you think I'm gonna burn the meat outside of its designated time, for example, then what's the problem? It's going to be pigul according to Beit Hillel, but it's not going to be pigul according to Beit Shammai because you didn't have it in both of the placings, and both the placements are critical. And ein mefaglim b'chatzi matir. There's no pigul if it's only half the process. So the answer is obvious. Amar le Rava. Rava answers ki itcha lehetera itcha. The havale Beit Shammai lechumra. When they asked the question about the machloka between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, what they asked is how many matanot are ma'akvot, like how many matanot are essential. That was the focus of their question. And on that issue, Beit Hillel is the one who's more lenient. He says, oh, all you need is only one. It's true that it ends up leading to a chumrah, but the main focus of this was really the question about what permits the continuation of the process and what affects atonement. And that's only one according to Beit Hillel, and therefore he's the more lenient one. Okay, even though it's funny, when we read our Mishnah, by the way, we were saying that the focus, even though you think the focus is that machlok, and in the end the focus becomes, well, when is the pigul machshava going to affect it? Because kind of the focus of our Mishnah was really pigul. But he's saying here is really for the main thing, which is, does it affect atonement or not? He's more lenient, Beit Hillel is more lenient, and that's why it's not on the list. Now we're going to have a statement of Rabbi Yochanan, and then Rav Pappa expands on that a lot more, which is what's the status of these other three placements? Because the three placements we just said aren't necessary. But the question is, do they have the same laws as the first one or not? So in some ways, yes, in some ways, no. So Rabbi Yochanan brings three issues. Two of them, it's going to be just like the first placing. And in one issue, it's going to be different. Shalosh matanot, and then we're going to have Rav Pappa, who puts 8 in ways that it's similar and 4 in ways that it's different. He's going to have a much more expansive list. Shalosh matanot shebechatat, there's the three matanot, the three placings that are not critical. Number one, einam ba'ot balayla. You can't put them on the altar at night, though. In other words, you might say they're not critical, and then maybe, we could be lenient with them in all sorts of ways. But no, the placements have to be done during the day. And if you're going to do them, you do them during the day. If you do them at night, that you definitely can't do that. But on the other hand, we're going to be lenient. The ba'ot la'achar mita. What is this? If you have a korban that you sacrifice, the Kohen sacrificed the korban for someone who sinned, and then they die before the blood gets sprinkled, the whole korban's disqualified. And if it was before the slaughtering, that you actually have to leave the animal to die, you can't do anything with it because it was sanctified, but it can't be brought. If the blood wasn't sprinkled, we don't sprinkle the blood. We're done. Okay, we have to take everything out of the temple. It's disqualified. But if the person died exactly in between after one placement was done, which basically means the atonement was affected. If the atonement was affected, then we can continue to bring the other bloods, because the whole issue with a chatat that the owner died is that, we have no way to get atonement for this person anymore. They're dead, so everything is disqualified. But in this case, the blood already atoned from the first one. So the other three you can just continue the process. You can burn the meat, you can do everything after, because everything is basically the korban was completely done right for the critical elements because the person was still alive. So that in that way it's different. And now we're back to a way it's similar to the others. So the first one, if you decided, you put the placement of one on the altar, and then you left the temple and then went to a different altar that existed outside the temple. You're not supposed to put offerings there. If you offer things that are supposed to be offered inside and you bring them outside, you're liable. So here he says you're liable for these bloods also, even though, again, they're not critical elements, but you can't bring them outside because they really do belong on the inner altar. So if you bring them outside, you're chayav for that. Amar of Pappa, yesh mein kitchilato v'yesh mein kisafo. So he now expands and he says there's some ways it's like the first one and there's some ways it's not. Okay, he just uses this language like the beginning and like the end. It means is right that it's treated like the first one, and in some ways it's unique, and we're going to be much more lenient with that. So here's our list. 8, first, that it's like the first one. Chutz and laila, that we discussed already, taking it outside and offering it on an altar outside, and night. Zarut, if a zar puts the blood on, a non-Kohen, it's a problem. Klei shared, it has to be in a sanctified vessel. Keren, it has to be put on the corners, right, at the top of the altar. Etzba, the Kohen puts them on the corners of the altar with his finger. That still happens with the others. Kibus, it is the topic of Shulin Mishkan today in Flashback. You can read it. Kibus is this halacha, which we're going to get into a little bit more now, which is if the blood, before you sprinkle the blood, if the blood gets on your clothes, Your clothes have to be washed specifically in the azara. Okay, you can't take them out and wash them somewhere else. They have to be, there's a special law of kibus. That's if it's before the blood was sprinkled. If it happened after the blood was sprinkled, it doesn't need kibus. So now what we're going to say is, if it's done before all four, you need kibus, that's for sure. But since one is ma'akev, only one is ma'akev, maybe before the other three, it's like considered as if it's done. But no, if you're in between 1 and 3 and the blood gets on you, also you need to do kibus in the azara, because in that way they're treated the same as the first one. And shirayim. Okay, what's the law of shirayim? Rashi says here, the chatat, this is the whole halacha we learned before. If you collect the blood in 4 cups, okay, the truth is I don't need to read Rashi. If you collect the blood in 4 cups, and then you sprinkle the blood only from one of the cups, so you only dump from that cup. Remember, there was a machloket about this. You dump the rest of it onto the base of the altar, but not from the other cups you didn't even use. So now the question is, what if you had in 4 cups, and each cup you use to put a different placement on the altar? So each blood is considered like the first one, like it's critical enough that we now have to pour the rest of the blood from each of those cups on the base of the altar, because each was used as a placement on the altar. So that's all ketchilatan. But these other ones, it's different. Mita, that's what we just discussed. If the owner dies after the first, before the other 3. Lo sharia, it doesn't permit anything. It's not a matir, right? Like we said before, because already everything's permitted with the first sprinkling. Lo mifagla, and therefore there's no pigul, right? If you have a pigul thought during that, you think, oh, I'm going to burn the meat outside of its time, it's not pigul. And lo ayla legavai, and then kisafan is all these are like safan. Lo ayla legavai means if you bring the blood, remember, if you bring the blood of a sin offering into the sanctuary, disqualifies the sacrifice, but that's only before any of the blood was sprinkled. If you now took this blood that's supposed to go the other 3 and you bring it inside, it doesn't disqualify the korban. Why not? Because again, the korban was already accepted, so you can't disqualify the korban at this point. And this is actually darshan from the pasuk there, okay? Because it says, if you bring it in to achieve atonement. Now, atonement was already achieved here. So if you bring this blood and it doesn't disqualify, and by the way, the pasuk says there, not only does it disqualify the korban, the pasuk says you have to burn it. Pasuk actually doesn't say it disqualifies, but they learn that it's disqualified. And it says by esh yisaref, okay, tisaref, you have to burn the blood. You don't need to burn this blood now because it's not that, right? This isn't relevant to it. Amar Rav Pappa. Now, Rav Pappa brings a proof, Menami Allah. What's my proof about the kibus? That also before these 3 placings, if you're standing at that moment and the blood gets on you, you also have to wash the garments in the azara. Titnan, right? That's the temple courtyard where all this is going on. Titnan, it says in the Mishnah, Nitaz min atzavar labeged enota kibus. If it spritzes from the animal as it's slaughtering onto the people, okay, I went to the Zevachim ones, which is they do the Korban Pesach, and the Shomronim, the Samaritans, and everyone was wearing white, and then like a few minutes later after they slaughter the animal, everyone's got red on their clothes. Like that it's just what happens, okay? Now some of the blood needs kibus, some of it doesn't. So if it goes from the neck of the animal onto the clothes, it doesn't need kibus. Mina keren umina yesod, if it comes once it went on the corner and then it comes onto your clothes or on the base, right? Like you can imagine, you're pouring it and it splatters back at you once it already went there. So you don't need kibus. So what is you learn from here? It sounds like only once it reaches the keren, but if it's going to go on the keren, which is also before sprinkling number 2 and 3 and 4, right? So it sounds like you will need kibus, and that's my proof. The Gemara wants to reject this and say, what are you talking about? This is all a unique opinion. You can't prove it from here what the rabbis would say. Why is this a unique opinion? Because v'litamech min yesod eno ta'un kibus. Right? It says from the yesod, it doesn't need kibus, which would lead you, your inference would lead you to say, haminaro oily yesod ta'un kibus. Now it says anything before it gets to the yesod, which is after all 4 placements of the blood finished, right? Now, before it goes to the yesod, it would sound like you need kibus. Now the pasuk says, and the drasha on the pasuk is asher yazeh. Okay, when it says you have to do kibus, it says that which you sprinkle. Ktiv prat lezeh shekvar huzah. This comes to exclude if you already did the sprinkling. So it sounds like, according to the rabbis, you wouldn't, before the yesod, you're already done with all the sprinkling, right? You still have to pour it on the yesod, but that's just the shirayim. That's not what we're talking about here. So Hamani, who does this hold like? Rabbi Nechemia. Now, why do we think this holds by Rabbi Nechemia? And then we're going to say this whole mission is Rabbi Nechemia. It's not the rabbis. It doesn't teach you anything because it's an outlier's opinion. How do we know this? Because Rabbi Nechemia says, Shayarei hadam shikrivam bachutz chayav. Now, he says something which is not necessarily the same thing, but we're going to assume it is, which is if you take the remainders of the blood and instead of pouring on the base of the altar, you bring it to a different altar that's outside the temple, you're liable. That's like anything you do outside. Now, we assume that means that he treats the remainder like the actual blood itself. And that's why this source says, even if you're standing before doing the yesod, and it doesn't say that, but the inference is that even before you pour it on the yesod and it gets on your body, on your clothes, you're going to need to wash those clothes in the Yazarah. But that would be Rabbi Nechemia who equates the shirayim with the blood. To which the Gemara says, who's to say that's what Rabbi Nechemia does? He wasn't talking about washing clothes, if you noticed. The Evarim Updarim are not a critical part either, right? Those are the parts that get burned on the altar. Now, and neither is the shirayim. And yet, if you take those Evarim Updarim and burn them somewhere else, you're going to be liable. So that's what the shirayim. It doesn't mean the shirayim are like the blood. The shirayim are not like the blood. They're more like the less critical parts of the Evarim Updarim. So you can't say that he's going to say the same thing. Kibus mishamalei. Who's to say he says also for kibus? Just because he says the shirayim you're chayav outside doesn't mean he necessarily thinks that they're equal to the blood and you would need kibus for them. And then this Mishnah may be it, right? Maybe this could prove Rav Pappa. The Gemara says im. Actually, it is really Rabbi Nechemia. He does say kibus only, and we're going to prove that tomorrow. Okay, so we'll come back here and we'll kind of get back into this sugya in tomorrow's daf. So let's just do our summary. We started with all the psukim about if we say we go with the average, right? We have two questions from Suk, right? We did the tefillin one yesterday. We did the sukkah one today, and the tuma dam leida, okay, the blood after childbirth. Then the shvu'ayim shiv'im. Then we got to right, and those we resolved all the difficulties that we asked from there. Then we got to this other drasha for what the source of Beit Hillel for one chatat is ma'akev and not any more than that. V'chiper, v'chiper, v'chipel. We tried to say, right, it can't be logic because logic could go in both directions. Is it like the ones outside? Is it like the ones inside? We couldn't figure out. So we used this drasha. Then we had two difficulties with it. Don't you need the word v'chiper? No, we have a nislach. Couldn't you learn a different thing from v'chiper? And that we took a while, but we rejected that other possibility of maybe some combo of lamala and lamata, or maybe all lamata could be. Maybe that's just teaching, but that you need them all. In the end, we rejected them both. Then we got to Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's quoting of the Machlokah Beit Shammai Beit Hillel, pointing out that Beit Shammai is really more lenient when it comes to pigul. If that's the case, why wasn't this in the list? Because on the other issue of the matir issue, and that was the main issue. He's more right. Beit Hillel is actually the more lenient one. Then we got to these methods in which laws in which the 3 extra sprinklings that again are mitzvah, they're important to do, but they're not necessary. So because they're not necessary and you affect the Talmud already from the first one, well, in what ways are they similar and have to be done the same way? And in what ways are the laws for them different? And that we had 2 and 1, right? 2 ways they're similar, 1 they're different. For Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Pappa was 8 and 4. And then we're dealing with this kibus because what Rav Pappa tried to prove kibus from this Mishnah, but the Gemara is trying to counter and say that Mishnah is only Rabbi Nechemia. It's an outlier opinion. You can't really prove your opinion from there. So we're in the middle of that, and we will get back to that in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a good day and a chodesh tov, and don't forget about the Tani challenge. See who you can challenge to join it. Have a good day.